Following on from another video I've done recently all about athletes who choke, today I talk a little bit more about a book I mentioned in that, a little bit of a review of the book, a little bit of what's going on in that book and why I sort of talk about it a bit. It's all to do with psychology, preventing choking, being in the moment, and this concept called flow state. So without any further ado, let's get into it. Hey guys, Nick here. Welcome back to the channel talking science of endurance and everything sports science in general. Thanks to everyone who's already subscribed so far, but I'm really enjoying all the discussion that's going on in the comments. So please, if you're not a part of it, hit that big red button, that subscribe button down below to join in with a great community that's building at the moment and keep supporting the channel. As I mentioned in the intro, today's video is about a book that I mentioned in my video all about athletes and choking and how to prevent choking, the psychology of performance, making sure we perform when we need to. And I'll link that video above here and down in the description as well. But the book I was referring to was this one here. It's called The Rise of Superman. It's by Steven Kotler. It's Decoding the Science of Ultimate Human Performance. Really, basically all it talks about is this concept of what we call flow state, but it explores it in a very different way. So commonly, a lot of us might think about, all right, how do we get better at improving our performance? Well, let's look to people who've been there and done that in our sport. And I think where this book was really engaging for me, and for those of you who know me a little bit better, and I talk about this a fair bit, is I'm not a great reader of books, but this is the only book that I've picked up and read 2-3 times, compared to a majority of books that I try to pick up and read. I might get halfway through it or a quarter of the way through it and forget about it. This is probably one of the very few. There's a very small list of books that I've actually got all the way through. Because I'm just not a reader. It's not how I like to learn best, and that's probably why I make these videos, is because I'm more of a visual and listening type learner. But it's the type of thing in this book that it's not looking at examples of people within our own sports or within the endurance industry that have been there and done that and their strategies, because I think the bonus of not following the same path is that we can draw on the best information from external sources that might be a little bit more creative and innovative to push us in a more positive direction, accelerate our development. And where this book actually follows most of its principles is and case studies is around extreme sports. So snowboarders, skiers, base jumpers. There's a really good example of a group of Red Bull base jumpers who were doing an action movie and flying through, jumping off the tops of buildings in Chicago and flying through in and around buildings in Chicago for a movie, and how they were able to have one shot basically at this perfect performance, and they nailed it first go. And it talks about the journey of them practicing to get to that point and how they sort of work through it. But the really critical part of this is all of these extreme sport athletes tap into this ability to perform when they need to, all the time, repeatedly, and they very rarely make mistakes. Of course, some of them have crashes and there's accidents, and that is going to be inherently part of the risk involved in some of these extreme sports. But it's also the type of thing that time and time again we hear about these athletes going to amazing things, whether it's Tony Hawk doing amazing tricks on a skateboard, Shaun White on the snowboarding side of things, people riding giant waves or climbing. If you've watched any of the documentaries about rock climbing on Netflix and things like that, the Dawn Wall and all of these type of things where people are going and climbing without ropes up the side of giant mountains and all this amazing stuff, very rarely do we hear about someone going and doing that and not being successful with it. It happens occasionally, but not all the time. And a lot of it is to do with athletes tapping into what we call flow state, which flow state essentially and fundamentally is the optimal state of consciousness, if you like. This is how it's, I guess, defined, where we feel and we perform at our best. To describe what that means, if you've ever been in a situation where you feel like everything around you is slowed down, and I've been in this myself, and it's a really weird sensation where you feel like things are going incredibly slow, that's not necessarily a bad thing. Particularly if you look down and you're like, if you're an athlete and you're looking down and you're watching, like, gee, I'm running at the same pace or I'm riding at the same speed and I feel like I'm going just as fast, but everything around me seems really slow in comparison and it feels like things are coming quite easily. That's the flow state we're talking about. And this can transfer across into your work. If you've ever been sitting in the office or doing your job and you just feel like you're smashing out tasks and really productive, that's that flow state we're tapping into. It's this optimal state where our mind is just prepared to take on the task at hand. And it can start to eliminate some of the distractions I talked about in that previous video, where we know that all of these external cues that may not be completely relevant to us performing our task can take us away and get us away from that positive execution. If we buy into some of those irrelevant cues and buy into the distraction, it's really easy to sort of get lost, and that's how performance starts to decline. So it's the type of thing we really want to start getting into a space where we can maximize as much of our performance as we can and really be involved in the moment. That's all this flow state is. It's how in-depthly and fully immersed you are within that present moment is going to give us the best result in performance, because all of our focus and all of our, I guess, mental energy, if you like, is on the task at hand, whether that is performing a triathlon, or whether that's running a marathon, whether it's a team sport and you're trying to make quality decisions. When you do make those good decisions on if it's picking up nutrition at aid station, or passing to a player that's open who's not under any pressure, all of these things are because we're in a frame of mind where we're solely, completely focused on what we have to complete right now. And then once that's completed, we move on to the next task that is in front of us and ahead of us. And really, this flow state is really just taking out all the unnecessary distractions and cues and honing in. And it really is an interesting thing, because coming back to the extreme sport athlete and why we can learn so much from that type of athlete is because they don't have a second chance necessarily. They go out there and perform, and the expectation is you perform or you get hurt, or it's a life or death circumstance. There is no room for error. And that's why these athletes are able to do it, because there's this innate processing in our brain that says, I have to be perfect here. I can't afford not to be. And they're so locked in. And yes, they're going to go through some routines and they might listen to music or whatever, but their brain is so focused and locked into this is the task at hand. I need to execute, or there's some significant consequences as a result. The body goes, well, and the mind goes, well, I'm going to execute because I don't want to see what those consequences are. It's much more difficult when the stakes aren't as high. And this is where practicing getting into this state can be difficult, because we're not tapping into that innate pressure. And that's what this book describes in terms of understanding that extreme sport athletes, they have that presented to them. They have the stimulus saying, you can't afford to miss here. You can't afford to make a mistake. Whereas if you're a triathlete, that stimulus isn't there. If you have a good performance or a bad performance, it's not necessarily a life or death circumstance. There's not necessarily massive consequences. Where there is consequences, though, and some of the things we don't necessarily think about, is if you go over to Kona and race Ironman World Champs, you're in a hot environment. If you don't come from a hot environment, what are the consequences of a bad race? The consequences are you could have severe dehydration if you don't make the correct decisions. What could severe dehydration look like? That could be hospitalization. You could be put on a drip. There's a whole number of things. If we buy too much into the negatives, though, it can be sort of overwhelming, and obviously we don't want to think about worst case scenarios and things like that, but there are some real consequences to doing some of these races. You're out there for 9 hours. Heat exhaustion is going to be a potential risk. All of these things that we don't necessarily think of and we ultimately take for granted are some of the things that extreme sport athletes have to worry about, because if I'm base jumping out and my parachute doesn't, if I'm base jumping off the top of a building, which I would personally never do, but my parachute doesn't go, I'm falling, and then that's it. There's no second chance. There's no second chance at anything. I need to make sure I'm perfect at execution. So really, this idea of flow state, and I really encourage you to look a little bit more into it. I'm going to talk a little bit more on the channel about it, because I think it's a really interesting thing that the more we can, I guess, be focused in the current moment, the more clear in terms of decisions are available to us. We know what decision we need to make when, follow and execute on the task that is at hand, and you're going to ultimately enhance your performance. Yes, physical preparation, all these things are a big part of getting us to a point where we can then execute, but being able to then execute is obviously the key thing, because that's what's going to happen in a race, that's what's going to happen in a game. When we need to perform, because all the preparation can mean absolutely nothing if you don't execute on the event day or during competition. I just wanted to give a little bit of a rundown of the book, because I think it's really interesting in terms of a read, and it's something that's really stuck with me. And like I said, I don't read a lot of books, so having this and having read through it 2-3 times, and I feel like I can read it again and again and again, is definitely something that I wanted to share with you. I know it's a little bit of a different video, a little bit different take instead of the usual sports science, and yesterday I talked about improving lactate threshold. I know that, but I think these are some really interesting parts of performance that we can definitely, I guess, accelerate your development. If you're an athlete, if you're a coach, you can start to employ some of these strategies to get more out of your athletes. I think it makes up a massive part of performance, not just the physical stuff, but the psychological stuff is super critical, and I think it's very underrated at times. So that's a bit of a summary of my thoughts on the book. If you've read it, let me know what your thoughts were down below, or if you've got any other suggestions around books that sound similar to this, or any, I guess, resources that sound similar to this. Happy to hear what they are down below in the comments. As always, please consider subscribing to the channel to keep supporting it. Been loving your support so far. That is it for today, and we'll see you in the next one.